Morning. Why don't we pull in chairs a little bit more so that we're a tighter circle? So that we can all hear one another. Thank you for coming to this, the final in our Lenten Adult Ed series as part of the Rising Up from Our Roots conversations that we've been having about understanding our own rootedness in the lands we're indigenous to and to the stories of our ancestors, how they came to be on this land, our relationship to this land, and how that calls us to rise up in these times in which we're living with those with whom we share the land for the sake of love and justice. Ian and Dwight, will you join us? How is invitation or application? So I am very pleased to have with us today two friends in the work of restorative justice and two inspirational mentors to me too in this work, John Stoesz and Dole Hoyer. John is going to speak first and share a little bit about his own story and the work that he's doing as the founder of the Minnesota Repair Community. Then Dole will speak. Some of you know Dole already, but you'll learn more about the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery and its relationship to this work of the Minnesota Repair Community. And I'm going to ask you to write down your questions along the way and hold them. We're gonna have both of our speakers speak first, and then we will turn to questions and discussion at the end. Sound good? Thank you to John, who drove up this morning from Loud Mountain Lake to be with us. Thank you to Doe, who was marching with us yesterday and song leading while holding a huge megaphone and walking from Minnehaha Falls to Adote and leading us in song along the way, for coming back today to be with us again. We are very blessed to have you and your stories, to learn from the stories that you'll share with us. So John, please take it away.
Thank you, Susie. I'm just going to sit. I have some mallet issues here. Like a part of the circle. One of the stories I like is an Asian Indian story about.
Jack, can you put the microphone closer to your mouth?
I will put it closer to my mouth. An Asian Indian story about the blind people and the elephant. Some of you may know this story. Three blind people. There are various stories. I'll start with three blind people are describing what an elephant is. And one of the blind people has hold of the tail and says an elephant is like a rope. Another person has a leg and says an elephant is like a tree. Another person has a hold of the trunk, says an elephant is like a fire hose. Well, they're all right, but they're all wrong. That's our human predicament. Whatever our perspective, it is always partial. So I'm going to give my perspective. You all have your perspectives. And I think by sharing, we come a little bit closer to what the elephant is. Okay, I'm going to start by saying a little bit about Makoche Ikichubi. Many of you already know what it is, but we did this little flyer, which is, I think, very well done. It has the logo on the front. And if you turn it over to this side, the back, it says you can help Makoche Ikichubi return Dakota land, revitalize Dakota culture, and renew the environment. Those are the three aspects of Makoche Ikichubi. And the vision is that by the year 2050, Makoche will have at least 10 interconnected eco-villages in Minnesota. They'll recover 10 parcels of land. And if you open this up, there already are 3 eco-villages underway. Zani Otunwe, or Village of Healing near Granite Falls. Pohoju Otunwe, or Village of Vibrant Growth, a food production village in Mountain Lake, that's my hometown. And finally, Pakashada Otunwe, Painted Turtle Village, which is the newest one, which will be a wild racing community. So the idea is by 2050, there will be 10 of these. When Sarah Augustine was speaking, she talked about communities of hope. Coach should be building communities of hope. So that's a little bit. A little bit about the organization. So as I said, my hometown is Mountain Lake. I can go to that slide. That's the water tower. Of course, there are no mountains. I don't know where they came up with that name. And what happened to the lake? There was an original mountain lake. Let's go to the next slide. I'll talk about that in a second. But close to Mountain Lake, about 15 miles away as the crow flies, are the Jeffers petroglyphs. These are hundreds, perhaps thousands of stone etchings in a rock outcropping like this. These are the pink rocks like pipestone. Those are some of the etchings there. The oldest are at least 10,000 years old. So we know there have been Dakota people or the ancestors of the Dakota in the area for at least 10,000 years. Next slide. This is the mountain. It's actually just a hill, probably some dirt that the glaciers piled up and left. At one point, it was surrounded by a shallow lake. That was the original mountain lake. And an archaeological survey, a dig, uncovered remnants of a village there that date to 500 BC. So that was the original village of Mountain Lake. We don't know what it was called. That lake was drained for farmland in 1906. So for 30 years, Mountain Lake had no lake. But in 1936, a creek was dammed up on the north side of town to create the lake that is there today. So I'd say Minnesota is the home of 10,000 lakes and one man-made lake. Next one. So just a bit of history. In 1851, the Treaty of Traverse-des-Sioux, which actually shouldn't be called a treaty, it should be called a land swindle, took more than 20 million acres of Minnesota land, transferred it from the Dakota, or at that time people said the Sioux, to, at that time, the territory of Minnesota. So that gold area, nearly half the state, all in one fell swoop. A lot of, well, there was $1,665,000 that was promised to the Dakota, but very little of that money was actually paid. About 1/4 actually went to fur traders who, by outright deceit, stole 400,000 of the money for themselves. Two primary fur traders were Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey. Next slide. So that's how the land was wrested from the Dakota people. Then in 1862, at the end of 1862, Alexander Ramsey, at that time the second governor of Minnesota, announced in a speech before the state legislature, the Sioux Indians must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the boundaries of the state. And that became state policy. That happened. All of the land, all of the Dakota, Minnesota was taken. All of the Dakota, at least every one that they could find, was either killed or driven out of the state. Next slide. And then in the 1860s, there was the Homestead Act and the expansion of the railroads. These two things, the Homestead Act and the expansion of the railroads, are manifest destiny in action. This is what manifest destiny looked like in the 1860s in Minnesota. And my ancestors participated, probably unwittingly, in manifest destiny, in claiming land, many through the Homestead Act, some through the railroad in southwestern Minnesota. And that's how they got there, was by the railroad. Next. So in 2012, my family decided to sell my grandparents' this, of course, is on Dakota home. At that point, I had developed Indigenous relationships through a group called the Indigenous Visioning Circle of Mennonite Central Community Central States, where I worked. And so this is when the rubber hit the road. Had these values about returning land, and now I was getting money transferred into my checking account from the sale of land. So you can see where that land is there. It's actually closer to Butterfield than Mountain Lake. Butterfield is that little circle. It's in southwestern Minnesota, between Mankato and Woodley. Next slide. So I returned half the amount of my share of the inheritance to Indigenous groups working for land justice. Most went to Makoche too. So we talked about that a little bit. There was the director of Makoche was Ziatui. I understand when Ziatui spoke here sometime ago. Many of you may be.
You told me was preached here?
Who's that?
Was? No, somebody told me that. Okay.
Well, maybe not.
The land acknowledgement team did.
Well,
Okay. Maybe people were thinking of Winona LaDuke.
oh, could be.
We did have a preacher in a pre-Thanksgiving service some years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And I'm afraid I don't remember who it
okay.
was, but she was challenging us to think about the land we were on and turning it.
Yeah, that
to-
sounds like
I-
us.
That sounds like it.
Yeah.
It was, I was sitting next to Sarah and she was getting increasingly uncomfortable. It was a very meaningful experience for all of us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds like was.
Well, I'm gonna come back to my decision to, return. Eventually, what I decided to return half of the proceeds, most to Makoche Kichuki for land back. And the second largest amount to Sarah Augustine, which she used as seed money to start the colonial movements, dismantle the doctrine of discovery. That was, in my mind, land justice money. I make a distinction between land back which is buying back one parcel of land at a time, and land justice, which is dismantling the system of laws and policies which produced and continue to maintain land theft. In my opinion, we need to do both land back and land justice. Return land and change the policies. Next. Oh. When I was riding my truck, like I said, I have balance issues, so I ride a truck. And the year after I returned some funds, I did a 2,000-mile trek through 40 counties in Minnesota, mostly southern Minnesota, mostly the area of the land swindle, the 51 Treaty of Traverse City, to raise awareness about what can be done to return Dakota. I wanted to get a photograph and a newspaper article in the county seat newspaper in all 40 counties. I succeeded in 29. Some of them, they didn't want. Anyway, I felt okay about that. But before that ride began was, and another member of the governing council at that time, Neil McKay, who was teaching Dakota language at the University of Minnesota, who's since retired, came to Mountain Lake, my hometown, and actually did like in Dakota, what I would call a commissioning service. But they were very clear. My commission was not to organize Dakota people. My commission was to raise awareness and funds from white Minnesotans. And so that's something that still lives with me. Next slide. Okay, we're going to turn now to spiritual reflections. First, a couple comments about spiritual reflections. What is the meaning of truth in religion? That's an interesting question. Well, in general, I think truth means worthy of belief, but the standards vary. The standard for truth in science is different from the standard for truth in history, is different from the standard of truth in religion. Now, the theologian Paul Tillich gave this beautiful two-word definition for religion. Religion is ultimate commitment. Then the standard for truth in religion is worthy of ultimate commitment. It's a simple definition. We could give a much more complex definition, but let's go with that. Truth in religion is, the standard for truth in religion is worthy of our deepest allegiance, worthy of our ultimate commitment. We can ask about different varieties of Christianity. Are they worthy of our ultimate commitment or not? Maybe are not. How few are? It's 5%. Next. Well, that's
Yeah,
going
okay.
So let's start with Jesus. I'm Mennonite. In my tradition, following the life and teachings of Jesus is central. Discipleship is central. So I picked up this passage from Luke 4, where Jesus talks about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, preach good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. For me, following Jesus is worthy of my ultimate commitment. And this is the kernel of what Jesus' life and teaching is about. Note the last one, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's the Jubilee year. You guys probably know that. That's the year every 50 years when land is to be returned to the original families. I'm just going to go through these spiritual reflections fast, and then if there are questions or comments, we'll do those. Next. And I was influenced by what I call the Zacchaeus principle, which is if you benefit from an oppressive system, you must make, and you decide to follow Jesus, the love ethic of Jesus, then you must make amends to those oppressed by that system. And Zacchaeus decided to return half and 4 times as much to anyone he personally defrauded. So for me, that was the model. Return half. I don't know that I personally defrauded any Dakota people. I benefited from a system that defrauded the Dakota nation. The Dakota. Next. For me, this was the pivotal question. What does it mean to benefit from genocide, forced removal, and stolen? For me, that question was a hard one. In other words, it pierced my self-identity. And I think that if I long for healing, then I must wrestle with that question. It's not that my ancestors directly participated in genocide or forced removal or stolen, but they benefited from it, as I benefited. So the question is, what does it mean to be a beneficiary? It's not a question of guilt or something wrong that I did or that my ancestors did. Rather, it's a question about healing and conciliation. We long for healing and conciliation. Then we need to wrestle with this question. Next. And I also am very interested in the practice of restorative justice, which asks 3 questions. What harm was done to whom? In this case, the land was stolen from the Dakota people. How can the harm be repaired? Return of land. Who is responsible for making repair? The descendants of the white settlers. And then there's this important insight from the practitioners of restorative justice. Those who make repair experience healing. So if you want to heal for yourself, think through and act on what does it mean. A little bit, just a comment about return of land. People will object and say, well, that's unrealistic. Well, it's unrealistic to return all of it, but it's unjust to return none of it. And really what we are talking about is a tiny fraction. So don't get thrown by the observation that, well, we can't return it. It doesn't relieve our responsibility to be in relationship with Dakota people who are looking for justice. And ask the question, which land? And then how is that? Okay, next. So there is this book by Wes Howard Brooke, a theologian at Seattle University, called Come Out My People, And in that book, he argues that there are two religions in the Bible. Not Judaism and Christianity, but the religion of creation and the religion of empire. So if we look at the religion of creation, we find that especially in Genesis, Exodus, the prophets, and Jesus. It is an egalitarian vision, including outsiders, based on a gift or barter economy. And in that vision, land belongs to God. On the other hand, there is also in the Bible, our book calls the religion of empire. We find that especially in Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Proverbs. It is hierarchical. Suspicion of outsiders, if not the money or debt and debt economy. And land belongs to the king and those who can afford it. So according to Howard Luck, and this has influenced me a lot, there are these two religions in the Bible. Next slide. And if we look at the difference between an indigenous worldview and the dominant Western worldview, I think we can delineate these things. For a dominant Western worldview, it's human-centered, it's hierarchical, it's about rugged individualism, it is about materialism, material accumulation. It's about consumerism. You have to have an ever-growing economy. And land is economic commodity and private property. But it differs a lot from the dominant indigenous worldview, which is ecosystem centered. Because people are part of the ecosystem, but neither or above any other part, neither below or above any other part. It's egalitarian in that sense. The Dakota people, the Dakota and Lakota people talk about all my relations, which means I am in relationship with everything. Everything is in relationship. It's all about relationships and mutual dependence. Generosity rather than material accumulation. Harmony with nature. And land is seen as common and sacred. Now, if you go back to the West Howard Brooks, there's a similarity in the dominant Western world in the religion of it. And of similarity between the religion of creation and the indigenous world. Next. And this is my last spiritual reflection. It comes from John Fire Lanier, a Lakota philosopher of medicine man. I think he was born in 1906 or something, lived until the 1970s. He never learned to read or write, but he contacted someone who could read, who could write, to write down his thinking. And in any case, he has this reflection about the circle and the square. For a reader, the primary symbol is the circle. And the repetition of circles in the universe, the planets, stars, and the rainbow, reindeer seeds, symbols and reality at the same time, expressing the harmony of life and nature. And Reindeer observes that in contrast the symbol of non-Native Americans is the square, the primary symbol, which are seen in houses, office buildings, and walls. Club and wetland and square miles. Our world is full of symbols, but according to Langmuir, they are the wrong symbols. Symbols of separation. I believe this is a very interesting observation. So these are some of the influences on the spiritual. I am now going to turn it over to. I kind of set you up there, no? I don't know how you deal with them. You're okay.
Yeah. Hearing your story and the spiritual reflections that ground you in this work. So I started getting involved in the coalition in 2022, shortly after reading Sarah Augustyn's book, The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus and Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. And for me, when I found the coalition, I also found the Minnesota Repair Communities for Makoche Ikechukwi. And I guess maybe I'll start there a little bit and share a little bit more about the Minnesota Repair Communities. Yeah, John's a really humble guy. He's done a lot of amazing organizing work in Minnesota, like really, because I'm on staff with the coalition, I get to see kind of what's happening all across Turtle Island, and we're really far ahead here in Minnesota. And a lot of that has to do with John Stoesz's commitment to this work and the seriousness with which he holds that commission that he was talking about from the Dakota elders at Makoche Ikechukwi. So I think I learned about the Minnesota Repair Communities through the local Showing Up for Racial Justice chapter, which maybe some of you are also involved with. And in I guess it was 2022, or maybe 2021, I'm forgetting my years now. Surge was a part of a legislative campaign. So you saw some of those pictures of the earth lodges in the pictures John showed. Well, when Makoche Ikechukwi first started building those, they received a cease and desist order from the city of Granite Falls because the structures they were building were in violation of the state building codes. And so I tell this story a lot in my work because, you know, what John was talking about in terms of communities of hope, right? This vision of liberated Dakota land in Minnesota. Well, that vision actually couldn't be fully actualized without changing laws and policies in the state of Minnesota. So we actually needed to create legislation that made it possible for Indigenous communities to apply for a building waiver so that these earth lodge structures could be legal. But luckily, that was something that legislators were willing to do. I think we passed it in one legislative session. And now we can see like the amazing impact of that just a couple of years down the line. Makoche Ikechukwi has 3 villages now and a vision for more to come. And so, yeah, I share that story a lot because you know, we're often trying to explain like, how does the coalition's work kind of fit with some of this local work, which is very often specific to the Indigenous peoples on whose lands we're currently living, or, you know, we really want to be a part of land back in some way. But there's this much bigger picture that the coalition, I think, is often really trying to get people to see, which is that so much of land dispossession and land removal is legal under our current systems. And so just that example of, we had to change a law and policy in Minnesota for it to even be possible for Dakota people to build according to their traditional ways. Starts to make it more apparent how we, as folks of, white Euro descent or Christian descent, right, settlers, have a role in this work, right? So coalition is really all about calling those beneficiaries of systems of injustice into organizing for repair. And we specifically orient around repair as opposed to reparations, which is also something we hear a lot. Because we see that reparations is a little bit more transactional, like as if we could just assign an amount of money as redress, right? But we're talking about generations and generations of intergenerational trauma and harm, and there's no number that you can actually assign to make up for that. But a model of repair is actually calling us into an ongoing relational process where repair is defined on the terms of those indigenous peoples. And so we say repair is led by the injured party, and it's a mutual process that we engage in together. And so what that framing does is it moves us out of a transactional mode of relating to our indigenous relatives and into a relational one, hopefully for life, right? And yeah, that can be a kind of paradigm shift for some folks because we've often heard more about reparations than models for repair. So we hold that as the model of what we're calling settlers into. And we also really try to accompany communities that are doing this work across our network. One of the things we often say is there's no way we can do this work alone. We have to do this work in community. So very important at the congregational level or at these geographic community levels that we're finding each other, that we're accompanying each other along this journey of decolonization. Right? That's another word that we say a lot or we hear a lot, but what does that actually mean? What do we mean when we say decolonization? I think there's lots of different definitions, but in the coalition, we identify decolonization because we're particularly calling in settlers and beneficiaries of systems of injustice. We define it as relinquishing control of a subjugated people. So that is our work in decolonization, is to do the spiritual, the cultural, the structural change, transformation to actually relinquish control of subjugated people. And in that work, right, there's so much to affirm about indigenous cosmologies, indigenous worldview, ways of being in the and seeing the created world that, as John was pointing out, I think aligns with Christian tradition, at least religion of creation. There's actually a lot of synergy. The more and more I do this work, the more I really feel that. So I wanted to also, I'm like, do I touch on my spiritual grounding here, or do I say a few more things about the coalition? So I'll share just a few more ecological metaphors about the coalition that help me to imagine, like, what is it? How is it structured? And then I'll share a little bit more about my spiritual journey in this work personally. So we are a very wide network of very committed both individuals and groups of people working on this model for repair, right, in these different contexts. And if you've ever seen wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace is another name, can you kind of picture that flower? So what's really beautiful about this flower is there's a single stem And then it kind of branches off into all these tiny little clusters of flowers. And I love thinking about that as like the coalition structure, because we're a faith-based coalition, right? So in a lot of ways, we're finding ways to resource ourselves by grounding into a more decolonized Christian tradition, right? And so that stem for me, I'm like, oh, that's the spirit of life, right? That's animating all the work that we do, connecting everything that we're doing across this network. And then that spirit of life branches into all these different little tiny flowers and petals, which I imagine is like, the repair teams at different congregations, or the working groups that are working on structural change campaigns, right? And even if they're not all meeting together, they're all connected by this animating spirit of life, right? So perhaps you can visualize that, or I encourage you to also just look up a picture of Queen Anne's lace afterwards too. And then the other ecological metaphor that I want to share is with our repair network. So we have this repair network of congregations and communities. And we've been really rethinking, like, how can we really support these communities in structural change organizing work? Because it's not always evident, like, how we do that, right? And something, in Minnesota, we have legislative campaigns that we're putting forward every year, but that's not true everywhere. So we're starting to reimagine this repair network as mycelium, right, all across Turtle Island into Canada. And these points where we can have really strategic structural change campaigns are like our fruiting bodies, these mushrooms that we can see. And so ideally within this metaphor, wherever we live, we're connected in this mycelial network. And we're offering resources, whether that's of time and life energy of volunteer organizers, or resources to support the staff and volunteer organizers working on these things, that we're all connected and like ultimately doing this work. And so, so some of those strategic campaigns across our network, I was here a couple weeks ago and we talked more about Oak Flat. So that's a huge one, right? Where it's a now Supreme Court case that's up for consideration, that really brings the question of religious freedom for Native Americans in this country to the forefront of the discussion, and really has implications, right, for the future of making claims about sacred lands as a way to defend them from extractive industry. So, fruiting body campaign, right? Really strategic, something that's bringing the doctrine of discovery to light in this campaign. And we have on the East Coast, some members of the Shinnecock Nation have reached out to us asking for support. So the Shinnecock Nation has their reservation on Long Island, and they're right next to one of the wealthiest communities in this country, the Hamptons, probably. Yeah, and so here's what's really disturbing about that. So much wealth and affluence, right, in the Hamptons. Think of all the films and TV shows where that's been held up, right? Well, there's no sewage treatment on the Hamptons. So that means all solid waste from these homes is going into Shinnecock Bay, which is the center of livelihood for the Shinnecock Nation, right? And so they have, this has been ongoing kind of refusal to put in this sewage treatment plant for decades. So they have, degraded the quality of that bay so significantly, right? That now the Shinnecock Nation's only real options for economic development in that area are these electronic billboards, right? That helps to generate some funding for their elder programs, for meal programs, things like that. And these wealthy folks in the Hamptons are continually bringing them into litigation over those billboards, claiming that those are unsightly. So, yeah, I know, I'm hearing,
Conversation continues.
What'd you say?
Colonization.
Colonization continues, exactly. So these are just examples, right, of where we can so clearly see this logic of the doctrine of discovery, right? So we're talking racial hierarchy, who gets to matter and who doesn't, right? Whose futures and livelihoods and cultures matters and whose don't. And just the way that, yeah, these ongoing processes that continue to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. So as we have this growing network, I mean, it's really amazing, you know, there's so much consciousness raising that's happening right now across all the denominations. So there is like this social movement is really starting to go somewhere, which is very exciting. And so we're seeing that, sensing that, and really wanting to strategically direct all of us into these structural change campaigns that really illuminate what we're talking about. And so, yeah, I guess I'll just say that, you know, we are very invitational in the coalition. We need you, right? Whatever that looks like. In my mind, I already think of Creekside UCC as like a repair network congregation, but maybe that's something you'd consider is like formally joining our network and becoming more involved in this work. And also for if anyone's just individually interested, we have working groups that folks can join. The Minnesota repair communities, we have monthly, we're on a schedule where every other month we meet as all the Minnesota repair communities. There's like 5 geographic communities in Minnesota. And then we meet as the Twin Cities repair community. And so you'd be more than welcome to join us in those meetings and get more involved in the work locally. But yeah, I think I'll just say that for now about the coalition. And then should I turn it over to questions or just say more about?
Let's check in about questions.
Yeah. Great.
So if we want to learn more about the doctrine of discovery, and if we want to learn more about the coalition and the coalition's work, I think possibly there are a couple of books that might help us get more involved in that. Could you say a little bit about those?
Tom's not a plant, I promise. Yeah, so our co-founders, Sarah Augustine and Sherry Hostetler have books. So Sarah wrote a book called The Land Is Not Empty, which I mentioned at the beginning. And this book is, she's kind of talked about it as like the 101 on the doctrine of discovery. And she really uses her own personal story, both working with Indigenous communities in Suriname, but also recognizing her own story as like there's a UN definition, internally displaced person. And so because she grew up away from her homelands and her culture, she kind of identifies with that term. And so all of this, you know, just using her personal story to really illustrate this ongoing impacts of the doctrine of discovery. So that's the first book.
Give her name again.
Oh yeah, Sarah Augustine.
Oh, there, okay.
Yep. And then Sarah and Sherry wrote a second book that is called So We and Our Children May Live. The subtitle is Following Jesus and Confronting the Climate Crisis. And this book is also really beautifully written. It includes a lot of story and poetry. But this book is really critiquing the green transition and pointing out that even these technologies that we're saying are going to save us, like electric vehicles, are still, we're in that paradigm of extraction. We're just extracting, you know, copper and lithium instead of oil and gas. And so it's really a call to recognize that it's the same thing we're being led to. And what they suggest is actually Indigenous cosmologies and worldviews have so much more to offer in terms of a reimagining of the future and the solutions to climate crisis. So they're both really good books. They make very good books, study books as well. And really start to help you see these structures that are intentionally kind of hidden from us in the dominant culture.
There's a book in the room, maybe Karen could hold it up. It's got a distinctive cover, so
So we know children live.
when you're ordering it, there you go.
Thanks to Tom and David, Jimmy, this
Oh.
morning, we talked about it yesterday, about it.
Tom loves that book, so maybe Tom should read the book.
What kind?
It's called So We and Our Children May Live.
Maybe you can maybe we can hand it around so folks can look at it. Can I ask a question and add something to, thank you so much, first of all, to both of you, both for what you embody. And how you share with one another, which is so open and vulnerable and challenging, but in a way that calls us in truly. And I appreciate that so much about this and just all my time that I've spent with both of you. And for what you're inviting us as a community into. There's one thing I wanted to go back to, and I don't know if it's a question, I suppose, to something you presented. Here we go, this slide. And one thing we had as one of our adult ed speakers, Kari Thoring. How many of you were here for Kari's presentation? Yeah, and so I thought of that as I saw this, John, in part because we tend to think when we hear indigenous, we tend to think of people who are indigenous to lands where they've been subjugated on those same lands, right? So that's the Dakota here, for example. But as I think I've said it once or twice here before, we're all indigenous to somewhere. And so you can also, there's indigenous people, and those are defined by the UN and so on, as those who are still living on the lands which they've been subjugated by colonial systems. But there's also indigeneity with a lower case I. And one thing that Kari showed us is that each of us comes from indigenous worldviews and traditions and practices that through colonialism, we've also lost connection with, and through our own ancestors' displacement from the lands that they're indigenous to and the processes of genocide and so on and so forth. So those indigenous ecosystem-centered, egalitarian, all-in relations, generosity, harmony with nature, land is common and sacred. For those who are in the Lenten small groups, we read that piece, Roots Deeper Than Whiteness, that spoke to some of that, the ways in which for that author's Irish ancestry, there was a lot of commitment to these value systems and these worldviews that were then disrupted as Irish folks were invited into whiteness, and became more aligned with what's being called here Western. But we might think of more as like Western modern colonial thinking in that sense. So I say that in order to invite you into thinking about how you are not disconnected from indigenous worldview. And as Kari said, at Standing Rock, they said, white people, connect with your own root culture. Don't come looking for our root culture. So it's also not about appropriating or taking on Dakota worldview. It's about connecting with our own ancestral indigenous worldviews and practices and understanding what it means to reconnect with those and to connect them with this land that's different, because the practices in Ireland and the Nordic practice, Kari shared, those were practices that were developed for that land over there, right? And we also have to understand what it means to develop our own practices that connect with the land here that we're living on. Does that make sense? John, I have a question for you. If you could speak a little bit about how this work has healed you. That was sort of the promise that you held out to us, or the possibility that you held out to us. And I'd like to hear what it's done for you in your healing work, what that means.
When I first learned about the doctrine of discovery, it was probably about 2007, 2006, 2007. I learned about it from a Dakota man, Harley Eagle. And I thought to myself, the land really was stolen. Because, we learned this history and of the noble pioneers, treaties and so forth. I think it was all agreed to. But the framework was there that the land was taken. And the land was taken before people actually, Western people, European people actually got in this country. Through the doctrine of discovery, which continues to shape our laws and policies. The doctrine of discovery is not only a series of papal proclamations from the 1400s, it is more importantly the body of law and policy in the United States today that continues to be shaped by that doctrine. So it's not something in the past. It is something in the present. And so when I realized that, I realized this is something that I have bought into and continue. How do I do that? I think for me, the Wi-Fi was part of the healing. I felt like I needed to do something physical. And I have very little idea what. That cleared things up for me was when student code helpers came down and the shading process and said, this is what you need to do. That was part of my healing. But okay, I now know somewhat what I need to do. Also, a big part of my healing was, first of all, actually returning funds to Makoche and to the Coalition for Life and Justice work. And calling other white Minnesotans to consider doing the same. For me, that's healing. I am trying to get out of this idea of individuals that I can heal with. I can't. That's very frustrating. Individualism is by and large in religion. We are always immersed in relationships. In fact, it's probably more accurate to say that there is nothing but relationships than to say that there is nothing but individuals. No, that's an abstraction. So currently my thoughts on healing are more about healing the collective, healing nature, healing each other, healing future generations, healing our relationships with parents. I don't really have answer to him. This is the way we do it. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know if that has helped.
No, that is helpful. I have to bring this to a formal close, unfortunately, because I gotta robe up and get back in there for worship. So thank you, John and Joe, so much for sharing. You have a few minutes. If you didn't get your question answered, maybe you can ask them privately. But thank you again. What a way to end our program.